Welcome back. Tonight, we're taking you deep into the heart of Africa, where the boundary between the living and the dead isn't just thin, it's sacred, ancient, and absolutely not to be crossed. You see, across the African continent, death isn't an ending, it's a transition. African societies consider death as a transition, not an end. The departed are now part of the ancestors, who will continue to influence the living. Proper and respectful burial is essential in facilitating the soul's peaceful transition. When someone dies, they don't simply disappear. They become amadlozi, ancestral spirits who watch over their families, guide the living, and protect their descendants. But here's what outsiders don't understand, what mining companies ignore, and what costs people everything. Not performing the proper rites is claimed to cause unrest, which can have negative spiritual consequences. In African tradition, disturbing a grave isn't just disrespectful, it's spiritual warfare. You're not just moving bones and dirt, you're severing the connection between the ancestors and their living descendants. You're trapping souls between worlds. And when you do that, the consequences aren't just supernatural, they're devastatingly real. From the mining fields of South Africa, where over 10 graves were relocated for the Tweefontein coal optimization project, to remote villages where construction crews unknowingly build over forgotten burial sites, the stories are always the same. Strange accidents, unexplained illnesses, businesses that mysteriously fail, families torn apart by misfortune. Tonight, we're sharing 4 true accounts that will make you understand why, in Africa, you never, and I mean never, step over old graves. These aren't just ghost stories. These are warnings passed down through generations, documented by traditional healers, and witnessed by families who learned too late that some boundaries should never be crossed. Because in Africa, the dead don't rest until justice is served, and when you disturb their peace, they'll make sure you never find yours. Marcus Ndaba was the kind of man who believed in facts, figures, and geological surveys. As a mining engineer for one of South Africa's largest coal companies, he'd spent 15 years turning dirt into profit, and he was damn good at it. When Glencore assigned him to oversee the expansion project in Emaleleni and Mpumalanga, Marcus saw it as just another job. Big machines, displaced families, relocated graves, it was all just paperwork to him. That was his first mistake. The Tweefontein project was massive. 120 families being displaced and moved off farms, compelling people as well as more than 10 graves to be relocated. Marcus had handled grave relocations before. Standard procedure: hire a funeral parlor, dig up the remains, move them to a new location, file the paperwork. Simple. What Marcus didn't know, what his company never bothered to tell him, was that in African tradition, there's a sacred process for moving the dead. Certain ceremonies, such as the animal sacrifice, drumming, and praying, are performed in a bid to escort the soul back home safely. You don't just dig up bones with shovels, you don't treat ancestral remains like construction debris. The families tried to warn him. Mrs. Elizabeth Mthembu, whose great-grandfather had been buried on the land since 1924, begged Marcus to wait. "You need the sangoma," she pleaded. "You need the proper rituals. If you move them without permission from the ancestors, there will be consequences." Marcus laughed. He actually laughed. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concerns, but we have a schedule to keep. The funeral parlor knows what they're doing." He was wrong. In instances where graves were excavated for reburial, they were often desecrated because it was not done by the proper authorities, but by regular funeral parlors, who simply dug up the remains with shovels, dismembering skeletons in the process. The workers treated the graves like any other excavation job. No ceremonies, no respect, no communication with the families. They just dug, loaded the remains into trucks, and dumped them in a mass grave at the new location. Some graves had no dates or even the names of the people buried there because they were just taken and placed by mines without consultation with families. What was particularly disrespectful was that some bore only the names of the funeral parlor. The problem started immediately. First, it was the machinery. Brand new equipment that had worked perfectly the day before suddenly began breaking down. Hydraulic failures, engine problems, electrical issues that the mechanics couldn't explain. Marcus chalked it up to coincidence and ordered replacements. Then the accidents began. A bulldozer operator named Sifo Mahlangu was working near where the old cemetery had been when his machine inexplicably rolled over. He survived, barely, but swore he'd seen an old man in traditional dress standing directly in front of the bulldozer just before it flipped. The safety investigation found no mechanical fault. Marcus was starting to feel uneasy, but he pushed forward. He had a reputation to maintain. The third week, things got personal. Marcus started having dreams, the same dream every single night. He was standing in a field surrounded by angry faces, people in traditional African dress pointing at him, speaking in languages he didn't understand but somehow knew were accusations. He'd wake up exhausted, covered in sweat, with the taste of dirt in his mouth. But it was the night visitor that finally broke him. Marcus was working late in his temporary office, a prefab building set up on the construction site, when he heard the singing. A low, mournful chant in what sounded like Zulu. He stepped outside and saw them. Dozens of figures in traditional dress standing where the old cemetery used to be. Men, women, children, all facing his office building, all singing the same haunting melody. Marcus rubbed his eyes. When he looked again, they were gone. The next morning, Marcus discovered that overnight, every single piece of machinery on the site had been vandalized. Not with spray paint or hammers, the damage was precise, almost surgical. Hydraulic lines were cut in exact patterns. Electronic systems were disabled in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of the equipment. The cost of repairs and replacement would set the project back months, but the message was clear. Marcus finally did what he should have done from the beginning. He called Mrs. Mthembu and asked for help. She arranged for a Sangoma, a traditional healer named Nomsa Dlamini, to come to the site and communicate with the ancestors. What the Sangoma told him made Marcus's blood run cold. "The amadlozi are very angry," she said after consulting her bones. "You have broken the connection between them and their families. You have treated them like rubbish. They will not rest until you restore their dignity." The solution was expensive and time-consuming, but Marcus had no choice. They had to re-exhume every single grave, identify the remains using DNA testing where possible, and rebury each person with proper African funeral rites. Animal sacrifices, traditional prayers, ceremonial drumming. Families repeatedly seek their blessings in the form of prayers, rituals, and offerings to ancestors. The process took 6 months and cost the company millions. But gradually, the accidents stopped. The machinery worked. The workers felt safe. Marcus learned something that changed his entire worldview. Dispossession does not only encompass events of deprivation and the loss of land and property, but also covers the loss of the incorporeal. The relocation of African ancestral graves illustrates how communities not only lose the material, land and tombs, but also lose their intangible possessions, ancestral connection, identity, heritage, and belonging. Today, Marcus requires cultural impact assessments and traditional healer consultations for every project he oversees. He learned the hard way that in Africa, you don't just move dirt and bones, you move souls. And souls remember. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto thought he was getting the opportunity of a lifetime when the University of the Witwatersrand offered him a position as head of the new engineering complex construction project. Fresh from completing his PhD in civil engineering at Tokyo University, Kenji was eager to apply modern Japanese construction techniques to this ambitious South African development. The site chosen for the complex was perfect, a large, relatively flat area on the outskirts of Johannesburg that had been unused for decades. What Kenji didn't know, what the university administrators either didn't know or chose not to mention, was that the land had once been home to a Zulu community that was forcibly removed during apartheid in the 1960s. More importantly, it contained an old cemetery. Kenji approached the project with typical Japanese precision. Soil samples, environmental surveys, architectural planning, everything was methodical and thorough. But there was one survey he never thought to conduct, a cultural heritage assessment. The first indication that something was wrong came during the initial excavation. The construction crew, mostly local workers from nearby townships, became increasingly agitated as they worked. They whispered among themselves in Zulu and Xhosa, casting nervous glances at certain areas of the site. Foreman Moses Mthethwa finally approached Kenji with his concerns. "Dr. Yamamoto, the men are saying this land is not good for building. They say there are graves here, old graves from before the removals." Kenji, who had dealt with construction superstitions before, dismissed the concerns. "Moses, we've done all the proper surveys. There are no official records of any cemetery on this site. We need to stay on schedule." Moses's expression darkened. "Sir, not all of our people were buried in official places. During apartheid, when they moved us, they didn't care about our dead. Some families had to hide their burial sites to protect them." But Kenji was operating under tight deadlines and an even tighter budget. He ordered the work to continue. That was his second mistake. His first was not understanding that in African culture, the communities are believed to consist of the living, the dead, and the yet to be born. This is why, except for very highly incapacitating circumstances, Africans insist on burying their dead in a grave that they can access freely. 3 days later, the excavator hit the first grave. It wasn't marked. There was no headstone, no visible indication that anyone was buried there. But when the mechanical shovel pulled up a tangle of old cloth and human bones, the entire construction site went silent. The Zulu workers immediately stopped working and began backing away from the excavation. Some began a low, mournful chant. Others simply stared at Kenji with expressions that mixed fear and accusation. "We need to stop," Moses said quietly. "We need to call the amadlozi, the traditional healers. We need to ask permission from the ancestors." Kenji felt the pressure of deadlines and budget constraints. The university administrators were already breathing down his neck about delays. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We'll mark the location and have the remains removed properly later. Right now, we need to continue construction." The crew reluctantly returned to work, but Kenji could feel the change in atmosphere. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by tension and whispered conversations he couldn't understand. Over the next 2 weeks, they found 17 more graves. Each discovery made the workers more agitated. Some refused to work near the burial sites. Others quit entirely, but Kenji pushed forward, ordering each set of remains to be carefully removed and stored in the site office until proper arrangements could be made. He never made those arrangements. The consequences began subtly. Kenji started experiencing what he initially dismissed as stress-related symptoms, severe headaches that struck suddenly and disappeared just as quickly, exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure, strange dreams where he found himself standing in a field surrounded by angry voices speaking in clicking, rhythmic languages. But the real terror began when Kenji started seeing them. It started in his peripheral vision, dark figures moving just outside his line of sight. When he turned to look directly, there was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched, of being judged, never left. Then came the night when Kenji was working late in his apartment, reviewing construction plans, when he heard the singing. A deep, haunting melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He looked out his window and saw them. Dozens of figures in traditional Zulu dress, standing in perfect formation in the parking lot below, all looking up at his apartment window. Kenji blinked, and they were gone. The next morning brought worse news. Overnight, the construction site had been vandalized. All the stored remains were gone, not stolen, moved. They had been carefully arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the construction site, each set of bones positioned according to traditional burial customs. If a corpse is buried inside the house, the head is placed at the door with the legs inward, but if the grave is outside, then the head is placed by the right-hand side as determined by the approaching route to the grave. This is done for easy identification of where the head of the corpse is placed. Someone or something had arranged them exactly right. That's when Moses introduced Kenji to Gogo no Musa, an elderly Sangoma from nearby Alexandra Township. The traditional healer took one look at the construction site and shook her head gravely. "The amadlozi are very angry," she said through Moses' translation. "You have disturbed their rest without permission. You have treated them like rubbish instead of like the ancestors they are. Until you make this right, there will be no peace." Gogo no Musa explained what Kenji had unknowingly done. According to Ayed Semiton, the traditional African belief system is also referred to as ancestor worship and is based on an understanding that the life course is cyclical and not linear. Based on this system of belief, those who are dead are alive in a different world and can reincarnate and return to this world in new births. By disturbing the graves without proper rituals, Kenji had broken the connection between the ancestors and their living descendants. He had trapped spirits between worlds, and now they demanded justice. The solution required completely halting construction for 3 months, while proper traditional funeral rites were performed for each of the discovered remains. Animal sacrifices, traditional prayers, offerings to the ancestors. The university had to hire archaeologists, genealogists, and traditional healers to identify and properly rebury each person according to their cultural customs. The cost overruns were enormous. The delays set the project back by a full year, but gradually the disturbances stopped. The workers returned to normal productivity. Kenji's nightmares faded. The engineering complex was eventually completed, but not before a memorial garden was installed at the site of the old cemetery, along with a plaque acknowledging the people who had been buried there. Today, students and faculty regularly leave offerings at the memorial: flowers, traditional beer, small tokens of respect. Kenji learned something that no engineering textbook had taught him. In Africa, you don't just build on land, you build on history, on memory, on the resting places of the ancestors. And if you don't show proper respect, the ancestors will make sure your project never succeeds. He now requires cultural heritage surveys for every project he oversees, and he always consults with traditional healers before breaking ground, because some foundations, he learned, are more important than concrete and steel. Sarah Mitchell had built her reputation on transforming undesirable land into profitable developments. As a real estate developer from Cape Town, she had an eye for opportunity and the determination to see projects through no matter what obstacles arose. When she identified a large tract of unused land in the Eastern Cape near Mthatha, Sarah saw goldmine potential literally and figuratively. The property was perfect for her planned luxury eco-lodge, secluded, naturally beautiful, and best of all, incredibly cheap. The local community seemed eager to sell, and the government permits came through with surprising ease. Sarah should have asked herself why everything was going so smoothly. She should have wondered why the land had remained untouched for so long. Her first meeting with the traditional authority should have been a warning. Chief Mpendulo Madiba, a dignified elderly man who served as the local traditional leader, requested a meeting with Sarah before construction began. "This land has history," he told her gravely through his translator. "It is the resting place of many of our people. Some died in wars, some from sickness, some from old age. But all of them are amadlozi now ancestors who watch over us. If you wish to build here, you must first speak with them." Sarah listened politely, but privately dismissed his concerns as backward superstition. She was a modern businesswoman dealing with a multi-million rand development. She didn't have time for tribal rituals. "I appreciate your concerns, Chief Madiba," she said diplomatically, "but I've done all the legal surveys. There are no recorded cemeteries on this property. I'm sure we can work together to make this beneficial for everyone." Chief Madiba's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught something in his eyes: disappointment, maybe even pity. "The amadlozi do not appear on your surveys, Mrs. Mitchell, but they are here nonetheless, and they do not forget when they are disrespected." Sarah thanked him for his time and proceeded with her plans. Construction began in March 2019. Sarah had hired a crew from Cape Town, experienced professionals who had worked on her previous projects. But she also employed local workers, both to save costs and to demonstrate her commitment to community development. From day one, the local workers seemed nervous. They moved through the construction site with obvious reluctance, frequently stopping to whisper among themselves in Xhosa. Several times, Sarah noticed them gathering around certain spots on the property, speaking in low, urgent tones. Site foreman James Coekamore finally brought their concerns to Sarah's attention. "The local guys are saying there are graves here, Mrs. Mitchell. They want to bring in some kind of traditional healer to do ceremonies before we continue." Sarah felt her patience wearing thin. She was already behind schedule due to equipment delays and permit issues. She couldn't afford any more setbacks. "James, we've been over this. There are no official records of any burials on this property. We can't halt construction every time someone has a superstition. Keep the crew working." But the superstitions became harder to ignore when the excavation work began uncovering evidence that the local workers had been right. It started with small things: fragments of old pottery, pieces of metal that looked like traditional tools, scraps of fabric that seemed much older than anything that should have been on supposedly unused land. Then came the bones. The first skeleton was discovered during the excavation for the main lodge foundation. The construction crew was digging out the basement when the excavator bucket pulled up a complete human skull along with several other bones. The Cape Town crew stared in confusion, but the local workers immediately began backing away from the excavation site. Several began a low chanting that sent chills down Sarah's spine, even though she didn't understand the words. "We stop now," said Namakai Nkomo, one of the local workers. "We cannot continue until we ask forgiveness from the amadlozi." Sarah felt the weight of deadlines and investor expectations. The discovery would require archaeological surveys, government notifications, possible construction delays that could last months. Her investors were already getting nervous about the project timeline. She made a decision that would destroy everything she'd worked for. Cover it back up, she told James quietly. We'll deal with it later. Right now, we need to keep moving. Ma'am, I don't think. Just do it, James. They covered the remains and continued construction. Over the next 3 weeks, they found 11 more burial sites. Each time, Sarah ordered them covered and forgotten. Each time, the local workers became more agitated. Several quit. Others began coming to work with traditional protective items, small pouches around their necks, white chalk markings on their faces and arms. Mrs. Mitchell, Nomakaya pleaded, the amadlozi are angry. You must stop this. You must bring the Sangoma to make peace with them. Sarah's response was to ban traditional practices on the construction site and threaten to fire any worker who continued to spread superstitious nonsense. That's when the accidents began. When death occurs in Africa, divination as to the cause of death is sought from dead ancestors, with death causes usually attributed to spiritual elements, witchcraft, offending one's ancestors, or gods, rather than medical or physical reasons. First, it was equipment failures. Brand new machinery that inexplicably broke down, electrical systems that failed for no reason, concrete that wouldn't set properly despite perfect weather conditions. Then, workers started getting injured, nothing fatal, but a steady stream of accidents that insurance investigators couldn't explain. But the real terror began when Sarah started experiencing the haunting personally. It started with dreams. Every night, Sarah found herself standing in a vast field filled with people in traditional Xhosa dress. They stood in perfect silence, all facing her, all wearing expressions of profound sadness and disappointment. When she tried to speak, to apologize, no sound came from her throat. She would wake up exhausted, with the taste of dirt in her mouth and the strange feeling that she was being watched. The watching sensation followed her into her waking hours. Whether she was in her hotel room, on the construction site, or driving between locations, Sarah constantly felt observed by unseen eyes. Her peripheral vision seemed filled with moving shadows that disappeared when she turned to look directly. Then came the night that changed everything. Sarah was staying in a guest house in Manthatha, reviewing project plans, when she heard the singing, a deep, haunting melody that seemed to come from the very walls of her room. She looked out her window and saw them. Dozens of figures in traditional dress standing in the garden below, all looking up at her window. Unlike the dreams, these figures weren't sad or disappointed, they were angry. Sarah blinked, certain it was a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. When she looked again, they were gone. But on her window, written in what looked like mud, were Xhosa words she didn't understand. The next morning, the guest house owner translated them for her. Go home, you are not welcome here. That's when everything fell apart. Sarah arrived at the construction site to find chaos. Overnight, every piece of equipment had been vandalized, not with spray paint or hammers, but with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of construction machinery. Hydraulic lines were cut in exact patterns that would cause maximum damage. Electronic systems were systematically disabled. The concrete foundation that had been poured the day before was somehow cracked in a perfect spiderweb pattern that made it completely unusable. But most disturbing of all, the buried remains were no longer buried. All 12 sets of bones had been carefully exhumed and arranged in a precise circle around the construction site, positioned according to traditional burial customs. No one on Sarah's crew admitted to doing it. The security cameras showed nothing but empty darkness during the hours when the damage occurred. That's when James quit, followed by most of the Cape Town crew. I don't know what's happening here, Mrs. Mitchell, he said, but it's not natural, and I'm not sticking around to find out what comes next. Desperate and running out of options, Sarah finally did what she should have done from the beginning. She contacted Chief Madiba and asked for help. The chief listened to her story without comment, then arranged for a consultation with Mama Nosisa, one of the most respected Sangomas in the region. What Mama Nosisa told her shattered Sarah's worldview. The amadlozi have been trying to speak with you since you arrived, the traditional healer said through translation. But you would not listen. Now they are beyond anger. They are heartbroken. You have desecrated their resting places, ignored their descendants, and shown contempt for their spiritual presence. Mama Nosisa explained that the land Sarah had chosen for her development was an old battlefield where Xhosa warriors had fought British colonial forces in the 1800s. Many had died and been buried where they fell. Later, during the flu pandemic of 1918, it had become an overflow cemetery for a nearby community. The graves were unmarked because the families were too poor for headstones, but they were no less sacred. If this is not done, it is generally believed that the dead person may become a wandering ghost and will continue to torment those still living, especially members of deceased family who ought to give the deceased a befitting funeral. The solution would require abandoning the development entirely and converting the land into a memorial site with proper traditional burial rites for all the discovered remains. The cost would bankrupt Sarah's company and destroy her reputation in the development industry. But Mama Nosisa made it clear that there was no alternative. The amadlozi will not rest until their dignity is restored, she said, and until they rest, neither will you. Sarah spent the next year working with traditional authorities and archaeologists to properly identify and rebury the remains according to Xhosa customs. The process included animal sacrifices, traditional prayers, and ceremonies to ask forgiveness from the ancestors for the disrespect they had suffered. Her development company went bankrupt. Her investors sued her. Her reputation in the industry was destroyed. But gradually, the hauntings stopped. The dreams faded. The constant feeling of being watched disappeared. Today, the site is a memorial garden maintained by the local community. Sarah, now working as a cultural heritage consultant, helps other developers avoid the mistakes she made. She learned the hard way that in Africa, you don't just buy land. You inherit the responsibility for everyone who came before you, and if you don't honor that responsibility, the ancestors will make sure you pay the price. Dr. Amelia Thompson had spent her entire academic career studying African burial practices, so when the University of Cape Town offered her the chance to lead an excavation in the Northern Cape, she jumped at the opportunity. Unlike the mining companies and developers in our previous stories, Amelia approached her work with respect and cultural sensitivity. She had worked with traditional communities before, understood the importance of ancestral spirits in African culture, and always followed proper protocols for handling human remains. That's what made what happened to her so terrifying. The excavation site was a previously unknown settlement that had been discovered during a routine environmental survey for a proposed road expansion. Initial investigations suggested it was a Khoikhoi settlement from the 1600s, potentially one of the oldest intact sites ever found in the region. For an archaeologist specializing in pre-colonial Southern African cultures, it was the discovery of a lifetime. Amelia's first action was to meet with the local traditional authorities. She spent weeks consulting with Chief Cornelius Titus of the Komani San community and the local Nama Traditional Council, explaining her research goals and asking for permission to study the site. Unlike our previous protagonists, Amelia understood the spiritual significance of what she was proposing. African societies consider death as a transition, not an end. The departed are now part of the ancestors who will continue to influence the living. She knew that disturbing any burial sites would require elaborate traditional ceremonies and constant communication with the ancestors through traditional healers. Chief Titus was initially supportive but cautious. Our people believe that the ancestors must be consulted for any work involving the dead, he explained. If you treat them with respect, if you follow our customs, they may permit your studies, but if you anger them, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Amelia agreed to work closely with Mama Elizabeth Kruiper, an elderly traditional healer who could serve as an intermediary with the ancestral spirits. Every phase of the excavation would be preceded by traditional ceremonies. Any human remains would be handled according to Khoikhoi customs. The ancestors would be informed of every discovery and asked for permission to continue. For 3 months, everything went perfectly. The excavation revealed an incredibly well-preserved settlement. Pottery, tools, jewelry, evidence of trade with other communities, it was an archaeologist's dream. Amelia published preliminary papers that generated international excitement in the academic community. This site could rewrite the understanding of pre-colonial Southern African societies, but then they found the forbidden burial ground. It was Amelia's graduate student, David Coetzee, who made the discovery. He was working in what they thought was a storage area when his trowel hit something hard. Brushing away the sand revealed the edge of a large, flat stone. "Professor Thompson," David called, excitement clear in his voice. "I think I've found something significant." As they carefully excavated around the stone, it became clear they had discovered something unprecedented, a large burial chamber constructed from carefully fitted stone slabs. The workmanship was extraordinary, far more sophisticated than anything they had expected to find in a 1600s Khoikhoi settlement. Amelia immediately called for Mama Elizabeth to come to the site for consultation, but when the traditional healer arrived and saw what they had uncovered, her expression changed from curiosity to alarm. "No," she said firmly in Afrikaans, backing away from the excavation. "This is not for you. This is not for anyone. This must be covered again and left alone." Through her translator, Mama Elizabeth explained that the burial chamber wasn't part of the regular settlement. It was something much older and much more dangerous, a ritual burial site for a powerful spiritual leader, possibly a rainmaker or diviner, who had been interred according to ancient protocols that few people still understood. "Some of our ancestors," she said, "were buried with great power to protect their communities even in death. But that power is dangerous if it is disturbed without the proper knowledge and ceremonies. This one," she gestured toward the stone chamber, "this one should not be awakened." Amelia faced a dilemma that would define her career. This was potentially the most significant archaeological discovery in southern African history. The burial chamber could contain artifacts and information that would revolutionize understanding of pre-colonial spiritual practices. Her academic reputation, her funding, her entire career depended on fully excavating this site. But Mama Elizabeth was adamant. "Professor, I am telling you as someone who respects the ancestors, do not open that chamber. Cover it. Leave it. Some things are not meant for the living to see." Amelia made the decision that seemed right at the time. She would open the chamber, but only after extensive traditional ceremonies and with Mama Elizabeth's guidance. Surely, if they showed proper respect, if they followed all the correct protocols, the ancestors would understand that their intentions were honorable. Mama Elizabeth reluctantly agreed to attempt communication with the spirits, but her divination session yielded troubling results. "The bones are confused," she said after consulting her traditional divination set. "They speak of something very old, very powerful, and very angry. The spirit in that chamber has been disturbed before, long ago, and it remembers. It does not trust." Despite the warning, Amelia decided to proceed. This was too important a discovery to abandon based on spiritual concerns. The chamber was opened on a Tuesday morning in September 2018, with Mama Elizabeth conducting traditional prayers and offerings before the first stone was moved. The excavation was documented with meticulous care, photographed from every angle, handled with the utmost respect. Inside, they found something extraordinary: the mummified remains of what appeared to be a spiritual leader, buried with an array of artifacts that suggested enormous ceremonial importance. Carved staffs, protective amulets, pottery vessels filled with substances that were still unidentified, and most remarkably, a collection of stones arranged in patterns that seemed to correspond to southern African astronomical observations. It was exactly the kind of discovery that makes archaeological careers. For the first week after opening the chamber, everything seemed normal. The artifacts were carefully catalogued, the remains were handled with extreme reverence, and Mama Elizabeth continued to perform daily ceremonies to keep the ancestors informed of their work. But then Amelia started having the dreams. Every night, she found herself standing in a vast desert landscape under a night sky filled with stars she didn't recognize. In front of her stood a figure, tall, dignified, wearing traditional Khoikhoi dress but with an aura of power that made the air around him shimmer like heat waves. He never spoke, but Amelia could feel his presence in her mind, a consciousness ancient and furious. The dreams became more intense each night. The figure would point at Amelia and she would feel a crushing weight of judgment and anger. She would wake up gasping, her mouth full of sand, despite being hundreds of kilometers from any desert. David noticed the change in his professor first. "Dr. Thompson, are you feeling all right? You look exhausted and you've been speaking Khoikhoi words in your sleep." That was impossible. Amelia didn't speak Khoikhoi. She knew some basic words from her research, but nothing approaching fluency. When she mentioned the dreams to Mama Elizabeth, the traditional healer's face went pale. "He is trying to communicate with you directly," she said. "This is not normal. This is not safe. We must close the chamber immediately and perform cleansing ceremonies." But Amelia felt compelled to continue. The dreams, despite their frightening intensity, seemed to be showing her things: astronomical knowledge, medicinal practices, spiritual concepts that could revolutionize understanding of ancient African sciences. "I think he's trying to teach me something," she told Mama Elizabeth. "Maybe if I can understand what he wants to communicate, I can help preserve his knowledge for future generations." Mama Elizabeth shook her head gravely. "Professor, some knowledge is not meant for outsiders. Some power is too dangerous to share. This ancestor is not teaching you, he is warning you. But Amelia was beyond rational thought now. The dreams had become a nightly ritual that she both feared and craved. Each session brought new revelations, new insights into a spiritual and scientific tradition that predated European colonization by centuries. Then came the night when the dream became reality. Amelia woke in her tent to find herself no longer alone. The figure from her dreams was standing at the foot of her camp bed, not a vision or hallucination, but a physical presence that made the air around him ripple with otherworldly energy. When he spoke, it was in perfect English, though his lips didn't move. You have taken what was never meant to be taken. You have disturbed what was meant to rest. You have knowledge now that your people are not ready for. Amelia tried to speak, to explain her academic intentions, her respect for his culture, her desire to preserve ancient knowledge, but no sound came from her throat. I will give you a choice, the spirit continued. Return what you have taken. Seal the chamber. Forget what you have learned, or carry the responsibility of this knowledge forever, knowing that it may destroy everything you touch. The next morning, Amelia found herself back in the excavation site with no memory of how she had gotten there. The carefully catalogued artifacts from the chamber were arranged around her in the exact pattern they had been found in, as if they had never been moved. David found her there at sunrise, sitting in the center of the stone chamber, speaking in fluent Khoikhoi to an empty space. The medical examination found nothing physically wrong with Amelia, but she was changed. She could now speak and understand Khoikhoi as if she had grown up with the language. She possessed detailed knowledge of traditional astronomical practices, medicinal preparations, and spiritual ceremonies that she had never studied. More disturbing, she had begun accurately predicting weather patterns, drought cycles, and other environmental phenomena using traditional methods that she shouldn't have understood. Mama Elizabeth was not surprised. The ancestor gave her his knowledge, she explained, but that knowledge comes with the responsibility to protect it. She is no longer just a professor, she is a keeper of secrets. Following the spirit's instructions, Amelia sealed the chamber and removed all artifacts from the site. Her final report stated that the burial was too spiritually significant to disturb and recommended that the site be declared off-limits to further archaeological investigation. Her academic career effectively ended. Colleagues who had been excited about her discoveries were baffled by her sudden decision to abandon what could have been the most important find of the century. Funding dried up. Papers were withdrawn from publication. But Amelia found a new purpose. She now works as a cultural consultant, helping to protect indigenous burial sites from development and ensuring that archaeological work respects traditional spiritual practices. She still has the dreams, though they're different now. The ancient spirit no longer seems angry, but he continues to teach her things that she carefully keeps to herself. Some knowledge she has learned is too powerful to share with a world that isn't ready for it. People think archaeology is about digging up the past, she now tells her students. But in Africa, the past isn't buried, it's alive, watching, remembering, and if you're not careful, it will change you in ways you never expected. Amelia learned what our other protagonists discovered too late. In Africa, you don't just study the ancestors. If you show them proper respect, they might choose to study you back. And sometimes that's a responsibility that lasts forever. These 4 accounts span different regions, different decades, and different types of people: a mining engineer, a construction manager, a real estate developer, and an archaeologist. But they all learn the same fundamental truth. In Africa, the boundary between the living and the dead is not a wall. It's a doorway. And that doorway swings both ways. When ancestors reach the spiritual realm, they become family guardians. They act as intermediaries between the gods and humans, giving counsel and blessings. But when they're disrespected, when their resting places are disturbed without proper ceremonies, when their cultural traditions are ignored, they become something else entirely. They become judges. And they always deliver their verdict. The next time you're walking through Africa, whether you're visiting ancient sites, developing land, or simply exploring the continent's rich history, remember these stories. Look for the signs: areas where locals seem reluctant to go, land that seems too cheap or too perfect, communities that warn you about spiritual significance. And if you encounter what might be an old gravesite, an ancient burial ground, or a place where the ancestors rest, take this advice that could save your life. Stop. Show respect. Consult with traditional authorities, follow the proper protocols, because in Africa, you never know who might be watching. You never know whose rest you might be disturbing, and you never know what the consequences might be. The ancestors remember everything, and they never, ever forget.